So hi, I'm Teo Wickland. I'm a PhD candidate in urban planning at UCLA. So a bit about myself by way of introduction. I did my undergraduate degree in physics before working in business and technology for several years. I later decided to change careers, partly because I was disillusioned in working for capitalist companies that didn't seem to be doing anything to make the world a better place. I chose to switch careers to transportation because I wanted to help make transportation more sustainable and equitable, and I wanted to help develop transportation spaces as social spaces for meeting and interaction. But in my master's studies in transportation engineering and city planning, and in my work on university research teams and at local government agencies, I learned that the ideas that seemed incremental to me seemed radical to other people. So for example, I wrote my thesis on transportation planning for Polk Street in San Francisco. It was a street where over 8 walked, but most of the space was allocated for cars, and it had one of the city's highest concentrations of serious crashes between cars and pedestrians or bicyclists. So I thought, let's turn the street into a great place to walk, make it a linear park, add some bike lanes, maybe even take the historical stream that's been turned into a storm sewer and put it back on the surface. Wouldn't that be a great place to walk, to shop, to hang out, to be alive? Unfortunately, not many people at the Municipal Transportation Agency seem to agree with me. They contented themselves with proposing bike lanes and some bulb outs. And when the merchants complained about parking spaces being not even lost, but just moved around the corner, well, the agency canceled one of the bike lanes. And so then there was only a bike lane in one direction, plus the pedestrian and bus bulbs. So it was a very incremental project. I spent a year after graduation working for that transportation agency, and I saw what seemed to me like an immense lack of creativity and imagination. Rocking boats at City Hall or among influential local interests. So I said, let me go and do a PhD and study transportation planning. How did we get to this place where all we can do is add a few bulbs and one bike lane, when much more transformative change seems totally rational and to me not really radical at all? So what I'm here to share with you today are some of the research and findings that have come out of that project after some twists and turns along the way. To give you an overview of my presentation, first I'll introduce the framework of my research, how I position it with respect to other research in transportation studies, and concepts related to epistemology and technoscience. Next, I'll explain what I'm trying to get at with the idea of transportation epistemologies, and share 3 illustrative examples. And then finally conclude with a summary and recommendation. So without further ado, I define 5 contrasting axes that the research focuses more on policy and technology or on questions of culture and ideology. The second is a focus on technological solutions on the one hand, or on critical theory on the other. The third axis contrasts quantitative and logic-based research with qualitative and storytelling-oriented projects. Next, research that embraces modern scientific epistemologies. I'll define epistemologies in a moment, as compared to research that emphasizes more plural and subversive epistemologies. And finally, research that usually unintentionally reinforces or reproduces systems of modernity, coloniality, and extractivism, versus research that deliberately attempts to undermine that. So much research in transportation studies is on the left end of these 5 axes. Not all, I'm generalizing here, but we have a lot of research oriented on policy, technology, technical solutions, which is quantitative, uses scientific logic, and unfortunately tends to reproduce colonial and extractive relations. I'll describe those in a moment too. On the other hand, I have in my research to do the exact opposite, to focus on questions of culture and ideology, to engage critical theory, and to emphasize storytelling, all while engaging plural and non-standard epistemologies, and hopefully undermining modernity, coloniality, and extractivism. So now, as promised, what is epistemology? Epistemology comes from Greek roots meaning knowledge and know-how. In modern English, it may mean the study of knowledge and how we acquire knowledge, or it can refer to theories about knowledge, or finally, and this is the main way I use the term, it can mean a way of knowing, a way of acquiring knowledge. So I'm going to relate epistemology to something called technoscience. And to do that, we'll go through a few more definitions. I swear these are the last definitions I'll be offering today, so hang in there. I conceptualize knowledge as stories, and specifically stories. Science is a name for any system for developing new knowledge based on observation and experiment, which is not the same thing as modern science, which is much more specific. Modern science is a particular local knowledge tradition that comes from Europe, and it's based on the idea that scientists are separate from the objects they research, which brings us to technoscience, which is the process through which we embed modern scientific knowledge into technologies, which is, in the case of transportation, might include infrastructures, vehicles, transportation regulations, and so forth, even including institutions like transportation planning and engineering professions, and the universities that lead related research, excuse me. So yes, technologies here are not just physical things, but also social and political structures. Okay, so now that I've given some definitional overviews, we can talk about why I was motivated to focus my research on transportation epistemologies and why I think others should research transportation epistemologies as well. First of all, transportation systems have a lot of power. The way transportation works affects our social and economic situations, and the way we move around affects the experiences that we have, and therefore the knowledge we gain through that experience. They also structure the way we relate to nature, and therefore how we identify ourselves in the context of the planet we live on. Second is this issue of modernity coloniality. This frame comes from post-colonial studies and basically says that European modernity, on the one hand, and colonial style political and social systems, on the other hand, are actually one and the same. And these systems are about domination by supposedly superior groups over supposedly inferior groups, and developing standards that are uniform all over the world by forcing the ostensibly inferior groups to adapt to the ideas and cultures of the ostensibly superior groups. You see this all the time in socially constructed oppositions like rich and poor, men and women, developed and developing countries, people of color, so on and so forth. The problem is that transportation systems are implicated in this broader system of modernity coloniality, which is where transportation planning and engineering come in. We don't really do it on purpose, but we often unwittingly protect modern colonial institutions by using technical approaches and identifying standard universal solutions. But it's not all doom and gloom, because there's the hopeful side, which I refer to as abundant futures. Abundant futures is an idea that comes from environmental studies, particularly discussions around the Anthropocene. And it's an idea that we can fight for futures based on mutually supportive flourishing. And in these futures, rather than imposing standard knowledge, which is a sort of universal story, we can facilitate new and radically diverse storytelling. And all this will unlock new possibilities of emancipation and fulfillment for everyone. All right, let's get into the nitty-gritty. So just to illustrate, transportation science runs along a spectrum which might, on the one hand, facilitate diverse mobility cultures, and on the other hand, impose modern universals. From my dissertation research in French Polynesia, here's an ancient road in Anaho on the island of Nukuhiva. This road has been here for hundreds of years and was built by the ancestors of the people who live in Anaho today. So people who maintain the road are not just facilitating movement, they are also communing with their ancestors. Here is a road on the island of Mopiti. It's wide, flat, and made of concrete, but it's pretty well integrated in the local landscape. The same color and actually about the same texture as the broken coral on either side. And it's just wide enough for everyone to move slowly around the island, which is most often on bicycle, but sometimes on foot, on Vespa-style scooters, or in cars and pickup trucks. And here is some transportation infrastructure from Tahiti, where you can see everything has been pretty much leveled and paved smooth, lots of barriers, it's prioritizing cars, and pedestrians have to climb up and over the highway to get to the other side. As another example, I'll take you to southwestern France in the land region, where local people historically walked around on stilts. So hopefully you can see in this picture, there's a guy on stilts leaning against a tree at the edge of a bog. And the stilts were really adapted to this environment. This picture is from the 1800s. At the time, folks in this region often and most commonly used stilts to walk around through the bog land. But with modernization, France tried to make transportation in the region more standard. So here's a dry graded road running in front of a new post office in the same region at around the same time. And they were really trying to get rid of stilt walking because they thought it was backwards and uncivilized. And today, transportation in the land has the same standard infrastructure we have everywhere. They drain the bogs and basically force people to give up stilts by taking their land and mocking stilt walking. And so now instead of stilts, you mean highways like almost everywhere else in the world today. And so the flip side of that transportation technoscience is the transportation epistemologies, which both shape the technoscience, but also flow out of it. During my dissertation research, I went for a hike with some local friends on the island of Motiti. And it's like scaling the mountain. Most Americans would think to wear hiking boots or something like that, but local people go barefoot. And actually, our feet, human feet, are well adapted to walking, especially when you go barefoot a lot from a young age. So I was wearing sneakers. I've always lived in the US until for the past few years. I was sliding around and almost falling on my butt more than once. But their bare feet were gripping the ground and not sliding at all. So going barefoot is actually a way of knowing because of how you experience and interact with the earth and the ground. And it teaches you how to grip and walk so you don't fall. Some other of my friends on OPT often climb trees to collect coconuts or get fruits. And climbing a tree for them is like walking down the street. It's just totally natural. It's just another type of transportation. And that's also a way of knowing space and your relationships to nature in a different way. What about bikes? Well, bikes are modern, but you can do different things with them, like rocking wheelies. Rocking wheelies is not about getting from point A to point B. It's about something else, like exuberance and being alive and marking space, or this person with their child standing on the bike behind them. It's another way of knowing transportation and knowing how to move, even though they're appropriating modern technologies like bicycles and paved roads. So let's get a little bit more modern, looking at scooters. Even there are different ways of knowing and relating. Here's a guy on the left parking his scooter in his marijuana patch, and another in a paved lot outside a modern supermarket. These are totally different ways of relating to space and also relating to transportation destinations, but they're both running errands on scooters. So now think a little bit more about how standardized and rigid this type of bike infrastructure is that we see often in the US. This image is actually from NACDA, so it's like expressly a standard. Or even driving a car to the airport, for example, it's a bit less of a modern universal thing and more of a genuine human cultural experience to get dropped off with a hug by a loved one versus paying a stranger to deposit you. When we walk in stiff shoes on pavement, it tells you almost nothing about the space and place you're in. And freeways are one of the quintessential modern universals where we're totally separated from the land and just engaged in speed and pure movement and efficiency in reaching a destination. There's no wheelies or touching texture or any of that. So before I close, I'd like to meditate on 3 examples which illustrate what I'm talking about a little bit more. The first example regards how engaging transportation systems, The first example regards how engaging transportation systems shapes the way we know the world. So on the left is another bit of the informal road from Anaho that I showed earlier. And on the right is a standard highway, which could be almost anywhere in the world. And what we see on the left is local people have appropriated modern technology, concrete, to maintain and care for their ancestral road, which by the way is the only land route to their valley. And people walked on the concrete before it was dry, literally marking the road with their presence. The road is suitable for horseback riding, mountain biking, and walking. It's exactly what local people need and want from transportation. And it has so much meaning for them because they own it. On the right, we see that the government has come in and engineered a standard highway, which tries to be as uniform as possible, with markings referring to a standard set of rules like no passing, which if you break them can land you in trouble with the police. The meanings and ways of knowing that are embedded in the road and that you learn from using the road are totally different. A second example about some of the unintended consequences of modern transportation shows how we can understand transportation systems in different ways. In the Marquesas Islands, which includes Nukuhiva, for example, there were no mosquitoes prior to the 20th century. It was a visit from the German military early in the century, which inadvertently introduced mosquitoes. And now they're everywhere. They're a massive pain in the butt, and they also transmit diseases like dengue fever and chikungunya. Closer to home, in the US, we have trucks inadvertently spreading salmonella. And in this past year, we've seen global air networks create a global pandemic, like supply chain disruptions. So these are different types of unintended relationships produced through transportation, which also help us to better understand transportation. My third example concerns the role of transportation systems as a mode of analysis. So I will focus on the system of extractivism, which is basically a lens for modernity coloniality. And transportation is a key part of that system. Transportation here allows us to understand extractivism. In this system, we have militarized police who guard against and attack residents and demonstrators so that corporations can build and operate infrastructure to extract, transport, and refine fuels, which are then sold for use in transportation, ensuring that rich people get richer and transportation systems pollute our relationships with nature and each other. For example, leading to police harassment and killing of disfavored groups and more police repression, as well as adverse health and the accumulation of toxic and non-biodegradable waste in a linear one-way process. So in this case, we have transportation as a system which can help us to understand extractivism. And there you have it. So to recap my presentation, I began with a critique of transportation scholarship. I find that transportation scholarship often ignores cultural, ideological, and political factors in order to define problems as technical and to focus on technical solutions. Transportation epistemologies are a new approach that takes the opposite tack. Using the lens of transportation epistemologies, we may observe that transportation technoscience embeds modern colonial epistemologies in transportation systems. And these epistemologies then shape our ways of knowing, relating, and valuing whenever we use or even observe transportation systems. Finally, transportation systems are themselves epistemologies that may be applied in social, cultural, political, and economic phenomena. I will conclude with some suggestions for both researchers and practitioners. First, I would encourage researchers to pay much more attention to often hidden cultural and ideological contexts, which are not neutral or technical, but in fact political. Second, researchers should focus on promoting cultures and ideologies that emphasize love and generosity toward people and nature, and propose transportation changes accordingly. Third, as for practitioners, I think the most fundamental is to recognize that transportation is not technical and it is not neutral. Whatever we do, we are supporting some set of cultural, epistemological, and ideological norms to the detriment of others. Too many practitioners today assume that their role is technical and therefore act in service of unjust power structures without even realizing it. I strongly encourage practitioners to facilitate rather than applying off-the-shelf solutions. These interventions can and should be expressly political rather than trying to follow quote-unquote technical standards, actually just universalizations of the values of certain privileged groups. Thank you.